Oh, okay. The first is the recent suspension of USAID funding, primarily directed at developing nations. And the second is a glimpse at the direction that European politics is taking and its implications on Africa. Whereas the stoppage of US-led international development aid has had an immediate and far-reaching implications on our fragile healthcare systems, I believe it has also been a much-needed wake-up call to our leaders and policymakers, that they should recognize that our economies have become woefully dependent on the charity of foreign governments, and it is now the time to lay the foundation for self-sufficiency. The sunset of USAID has forced a level of economic policy introspection unseen in Africa for decades. And I believe the situation calls for a serious rethink in our development priorities as African governments. Difficult and unfamiliar choices will have to be made going forward. Our governments across the continent must weigh whether buying bullets to restock their armories is better than use of scarce resources for producing vaccines and mosquito nets needed to protect our infants from disease. Prioritization of expenditure in the absence of African financed subsidies in the health sector and in the education sector means that more attention is going to be paid by our citizens to the way governments handle their finances. And this will inevitably translate into demands for greater public participation and transparency in public financial management. The second I mentioned is what we are seeing in Western Europe with each passing year. More and more governments are leaning further and further to the right. The election of populist, nationalist administrations has been catalyzed by various factors. Among them, the huge cost of living attributed to the side effects of global shocks, and the scramble for stretched social services. Services that must be shared with millions of migrants flowing in from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and significantly from Africa. This right-leaning scenario that we see in Europe has some near-term implications for Africa. The truth of the matter is, the Europeans no longer want to see our immigrant boats laden with our young men and women landing on their shores. They are currently busy enacting laws to ensure that we never set foot in their countries, to partake in their resources without proper immigration documents. Our young people will soon have nowhere left to escape, nowhere to run away from the wars and poverty that define much of our continent's present realities. So what? With nowhere to go but home, with no one to turn to but themselves, I believe that our young people, and that is you, will eventually wake up to the fact Ethiopia, most of the rest of Africa has a dark colonial past that has, in a large part, been shaped and has, for the large part, shaped by the thinking of post-independence generations. When the wave of liberation swept across Africa in the early 1960s, late 1950s, it heralded new beginnings for all of us, as we have heard from our fathers here. It was an opportunity to govern ourselves and to determine our priorities. As our leaders sought to dismantle the vestiges of colonialism, there was widespread optimism that our newly independent states would create the environment for their citizens to thrive. You heard how, even in East Africa, they wanted from day one to form a federation right from the onset. And for a time, we lived the dream and savored the early wins of being our own masters. However, unfortunately, over time, instead of dismantling the colonial legacy, we inherited it and customized it even further to create a new African style of leadership. A style that leaned heavily on patronage, ethnic and religious mobilization, elitism and favoritism, the result of which was a quick deterioration in national cohesion, the entrenchment of corruption as an evil that led to the stagnation of our economies. There's a story President Museveni likes to tell of a leader, I don't like mentioning names, but one of our forefathers, who, when being questioned as to why he didn't want this federation to proceed, couldn't give a good explanation. But another Ugandan parliamentarian challenged him and said, the problem is that you want to be a big fish in a little pond so that you can sit on all the other little fish. And unfortunately, that was the mentality that resulted in many a problem on this continent. These weaknesses exposed our underbellies and left us vulnerable once again to the whims of foreign powers. They have exposed these vulnerabilities in our political constructs to manipulate our development trajectory as Africans, and unfortunately we are almost back to square one. This, however, is a story of years gone by. It does not have to be how our future will evolve. Now that you have an insight as to how we got here, I believe let us focus our attention on how to get out of this quandary that we find ourselves in. And we begin this by taking the first question: what does it mean today to be a young African in a world where developed nations are focused inward, prioritizing their national interests? Ladies and gentlemen, having served as president, I appreciate fully the pressure that elected leaders face on a daily basis. They have to be in tune with the mood and desires of their voting public and be seen to be direct